So there's actually
There is gluten-free pasta, so don't feel bad.
Okay, good. Okay. For people who are also who might be lactose intolerant, we have that. You can take Lactaid. We cover everything when it comes to fettuccine Alfredo on Shavuos in all shapes, forms, or sizes, gluten free, dairy free, etc. So the custom of eating dairy on Shavuot is mentioned in the Ramah, Rabbi Moshe Isserlis, in the laws of Shavuot, which the laws of Shavuot in the Shulchan Aruch are very, very brief. There's not much for Shavuot, especially after all of the laws of Pesach and Kashering and Matzah and Seder. You have the counting of the Omer, then you have this little couple of sentences about Shavuot. And a lot of Shavuot practices we're familiar with are customs. Shavuot is a holiday, as mentioned in the Torah. But in terms of how it's meant to be observed, or even what it's meant to commemorate, is not as well defined. It has to do with the statements found in the Talmud and customs which developed. One of which is the idea of eating dairy, and to fulfill this custom of eating dairy, people sometimes they alternate meals. They have all 4 meals dairy. I got a couple of queries this year. The fact that the second day of Shavuot is on Shabbos, so the Shabbos impact whether or not you're allowed to serve dairy. Bottom line is, essentially, you can serve dairy anytime you want. It just happens to be the cultural, gastronomical Jewish practices have centered around meat. Maybe it started with the sacrifices. Maybe it has to do with what was available. Maybe it has to do with the percentage of Jews who have lactose intolerance. Whatever the case may be, the celebrations have always seemed to lean towards meat, chicken, it's something, whatever, what we like to call meat or fleischiks, right? You get to that dairy Shabbos meal, you're wondering, like, what am I going to eat later, kind of a thing. It is what it is. But Shavuos, there has the idea of eating dairy over at Shavuos. Some say that you have a little dairy after Kiddush, and then you stop and wait, wash your mouth out, and then eat a real meat meal. All sorts of practices. But really, I want to just look at the idea of waiting in between meat and dairy, in particular waiting between dairy and meat. And it started with an article I saw by Rabbi Yair Hoffman from the 5 Towns Jewish Times a number of years ago. Fettuccine A and Halakhot was the title. I guess they were saving space. But he talks about the origins of Fettuccine Alfredo. So source number 1, the origin of this halakhic question takes place in Western Europe, more specifically in Rome, Italy, in the year 1914. An Italian woman who's expecting is constantly nauseated and cannot hold down any food. Her husband, a certain Mr. Di Lelio, happens to be a master chef. He invents a dish that his wife will be able to hold down. Mrs. Di Lelio succeeds in holding down her food. Her husband introduces the dish in his restaurant. The restaurant is a favorite of American tourists in Italy, and the new dish, a halacha question arises about this dish that affects restaurants today throughout the United States. The dish Mr. Di Lelio created was a pasta dish tossed with butter, heavy cream, and Parmesan cheese. I know most people have guessed that Mr. Di Lelio's first name was Alfredo. Our dish, of course, is called Fettuccine Alfredo. What's the halachic question? The idea of what kind of weight is needed between dairy in order to eat meat. We all know the idea you can't eat milk and meat together. And also the rabbis add, you have to wait between eating meat and then eating dairy. What about waiting between dairy and meat? That's the question that Rabbi Hoffman raises in the article. However, you look around a little bit, and it seems that Rabbi Hoffman may have gotten his origin story a little bit off, because when looking around for the origins of Fettuccine Alfredo, some more comprehensive studies of the subject, it seems to have certain origins much further back, but even the story with regards to Di Lelio and his wife, it seems a little bit off. I'm wondering if when we read Hoffman's version and people heard about the wife not being able to hold down food, wondering whether this would be something to hold down or not hold down. It seems that Lucas Cesari, in an article, The Invention of Fettuccine Alfredo, a love story, mentions that the details were a little bit different. Alfredo Di Lelio, inventor of the fettuccine that bears his name, was born in Rome in 1883 and got to start the family restaurant in Piazza Rosa, which later vanished to make room for the shopping arcade now known as Galleria Sordi. He was still a child when he began helping out at the family business run by his mother, Angelina. The establishment was rather anonymous, one of the many restaurants dotting the capital, and that's how it would have stayed had not been for the arrival of Armando, Alfredo's eldest son. This was in 1908, right? Different year. After giving birth, the mother Inez was so weak that Alfredo strove to come up with a food that would be nourishing yet easy to digest to help get his wife back on her feet. After she gave birth, not before. So here's what he did. He personally prepared some fettuccine using a semolina dough and mixed it with very fresh butter and Parmesan cheese. Then he said a prayer to Saint Anne, the patron saint of new mothers, and served it to Inez, saying, "If it's not to your taste, I'll eat it." I don't do the Italian accent so well. But she liked it, and she ate it, and she soon thereafter said that he should add it to the menu of the restaurant, and a star is born. Now, I have not seen any rabbis suggest that since the original Fettuccine Alfredo involved a prayer to Saint Anne, the patron saint of new mothers in Catholicism, that this should be considered idolatrous. I don't think that is an issue whatsoever. It's not raised at all. But this is just to straighten out the origin story. I don't want anyone to go around telling a story that's less than accurate about your Fettuccine Alfredo over this holiday. I will say that with regards to another practice of Shavuot, there is an idolatrous concern that does get raised. The Rama, again, mentions the custom of putting out greenery in homes and in synagogues on Shavuot. This has morphed into people buying flowers and flowers in the shul. Some places do the original greenery. But over in this place, the Vilna Gaon, Rabbi Eliyahu of Vilna, decries that practice and discourages it, and actually says since churches are more often decorated with greenery throughout the year, we should not have that in shuls on Shavuot, and he was very opposed to the custom, and some continue that custom. Others don't understand. If the Jews were doing it first, then why should we have to stop just because the non-Jews were doing it? Maybe if we're talking about greenery and trees in the synagogue, you're thinking Christmas tree. There could be some interplay with all of this. But for the most part, the Vilna Gaon's view is not widely accepted, and people see the greenery and the trees and the plants and the like as a way to beautify, in line with the description of Mount Sinai when the Torah was given. The Torah actually says very specifically that they had to be careful in advance of the presenting of the commandments that the sheep not graze on Mount Sinai, which means there must have been grass, there must have been a very green place, and you had to keep the cattle away. As well as other midrashim that Sinai sprouted all types of beautiful vegetation, so that's where that comes from. But non-Jewish foreign influence on Shavuot does appear with the Vilna Gaon's view of the vegetation. No one's saying anything that Fettuccine Alfredo is idolatrous. So what we are wondering though is how long do we have to wait between dairy and meat? And to understand that, we have to go back to the Gemara in Chulin, which discusses waiting in general between meat and dairy, because that's how the conversation will start, and that's where actually whether or not one has to wait between dairy and meat, the subject is raised. So source number 3, Chulin 105a, Rav Asi asked Rabbi Yochanan the following question: how much time should one wait between eating cheese and eating meat? In response to this question, Rabbi Yochanan said to him, no time at all. Okay, that seems pretty clear, no time at all. Rav Chisda says, if one ate meat, it is prohibited from to eat cheese immediately, as the meat contains fatty substances that stick to one's mouth and preserve the flavor of meat. But if he ate cheese, it is permitted for him to eat meat without delay. So Rav Chisda begins to recognize that there's what's the reason why you have to wait? And it has to do with a taste that lingers. But if he ate cheese, it is permitted for him to eat meat without delay. And this already will begin the discussion. Well, wait a second. Is that because you never have to wait after eating cheese, even if it has a taste? Or was the cheese that was being eaten, it had no taste the same way that meat had a taste? And that's the distinction. The fact that Rav Chisda puts it into the same sentence. There's a reason for waiting after meat. There's a fatty residue. There's a taste. When you eat cheese, you can eat meat immediately. Is that a definitive declarative statement? Or is it because of the fact that it doesn't have the same issue that meat does? And a little bit later, the Talmud mentions something which is addressing how long you have to wait between meat and dairy. Mar Ukva said, I am with regard to this matter like vinegar, son of wine. right? I'm a lot worse than my father because with respect to my father, right? Because the father is the wine and the son is the vinegar. The vinegar is not up to the same level as the wine. My practice is inferior to that of my father. As father, if he were to eat meat at his time, would not eat cheese until tomorrow at this time. He would wait 24 hours. As for me, only at this meal during which I eat meat do I not eat cheese. I don't eat them at the same meal. At a different meal on the same day, I will eat cheese. But the next meal, I'll have dairy. And this gets into the whole discussion of what is the appropriate amount of time to wait between meat and dairy. There was Mar Ukva says his father would wait a day. Mar Ukva would say he waits to the next meal. I imagine you're thinking about how long do you wait between meat and dairy? All right, it's common as 6 hours, 5 hours, 4 hours, 3 hours. Everyone's thinking, oh, I wish I was Dutch. I could wait only an hour or a half hour. But this is what the Talmud talks about. Talmud does not mention a specific duration, but we have the statement of Mar Ukva pointing out that there seems to have been waiting a longer amount of time between the meat and the dairy, and he's waiting a shorter amount of time between the meat and the dairy. What's the reason that there's waiting? And so, so we had, we had the Talmud mention this idea of the flavor. Rashi says, with regards to it's forbidden to eat cheese after the meat, source 4, because meat exudes fat that stays in the mouth and the taste stays in the mouth. It's all about the taste. If you get rid of the taste, can you then eat the dairy? Well, it gets back to what the Talmud says. Once upon a time, they wait for a long period. Now they wait a shorter period, and that has become accepted halakhic practice to wait between meat and dairy, regardless of the flavor. But the original reason for waiting was the flavor. The Rambam, source number 5, says that what's the reason? When a person ate meat first, whether the meat of an animal or the meat of fowl, right? It's the same between meat or chicken. He should not partake of milk afterwards unless he waits time for another meal, approximately 6 hours. The Rambam's language is kimoshe sha'os. This stringency is required because meat that becomes stuck between teeth and is not removed by cleaning. The Rambam is worried about the pieces, not about the flavor. So, the fact that the Rambam says approximately 6 hours leads to the idea of some people waiting 5 hours and a minute, waiting 4 hours because it's more than half. Some disagree with the Rambam and feel that it's different between the meat of an animal versus the meat of fowl. They start analyzing, which has a richer taste, beef or fowl, or which is more likely to get stuck in the teeth. Right? Rambam says it's all about getting stuck in the teeth. So if you floss well, you have less of a reason to wait as long a period of time. And this is all discussed by various later authorities that try to understand how long to wait. And they talk about all of these things. What happens if you find a piece of meat in your teeth 8 hours later? Do you have to wait another 6 hours? All these issues are addressed. For the most part, 6 hours is viewed as the most commonly accepted opinion because it seems to cover all the different bases. Plus, it's enough time for the taste to dissipate and to get the pieces out. And then others, of course, say it depends on when the next meal is. The Rama for Ashkenazim mentions the idea of an hour, mentions the idea of 6 hours. It seems the idea of 3 hours for those who wait that long emerged among some of the early authorities who talked about waiting to the next meal. How long culturally do we wait to the next meal? So if you have breakfast at 9, you have lunch at noon, right? Mid-afternoon snack and dinner, you're eating every 3 hours or so. Or you certainly don't. Or you certainly have times during the day when you don't go more than 3 hours between one meal and the next. So that's set the standard at 3 hours, and people should follow their practice. Questions, comments, or reactions to the idea of waiting, or the idea of how long, the duration to wait between meat and dairy, before we go specifically into the discussion of waiting between dairy and meat. Yeah. It's on mute.
So it's not really, the waiting between meat and dairy is not really sort of a protection against, if it gets too close, you're actually eating them in the same meal.
Correct. Look, I think there is that idea that you don't want there to be the taste mixing together, or you don't want there to be a little piece of the meat that falls in. but this just seems to be a rabbinic extension to the idea of not cooking them together.
Okay.
That's why, for example, that, for if you have a table and people are eating, you order takeout and someone ordered pizza and someone ordered a hot dog, you can eat on
Right.
the same table, but you're supposed to keep it separate on a separate plates or separate placemats. The idea of this meant to be the differentiation, that's meant to keep things separate. But the rabbis then added this idea of waiting. I guess it's kind of, strange if you're going to have both tastes mixed together on your palate or the like.
Okay, thank you.
So we saw that the Talmud explicitly raises the possibility of waiting between dairy and meat, and the Talmud seems pretty clear that it rejects that possibility. And where we need to understand it, especially because of Rav Chisda's comment, if one ate meat, it is prohibited for him to eat cheese immediately, as the meat contains fatty substances that stick to one's mouth and preserve the flavor of the meat. But if he ate cheese, it is permitted for him to eat meat without delay. Was it because cheese has no taste and therefore that's why? Or is it, can you eat cheese no matter what after meat? Are the two connected or not? If you have the same rationale after eating cheese as you do after eating meat, does the same waiting imply or not? So the Rabbi Moshe Isserlis raises this issue, Yoredea 89.2, source number 6. Some are stringent to wait 6 hours even with meat after cheese. And he quotes the Mordechai in the name of the Maharam. He quotes the Beit Yosef discussing this elsewhere. And so is the custom with hard cheese. We do not eat afterwards even poultry, like with cheese after meat. And so it is in the Zohar, right? There's a Kabbalistic practice. So remember, he doesn't say you have to. He says some are stringent. And he says some are stringent and they base this on the Zohar. Some are lenient and one should not protest against them. Some don't wait. They follow directly. It says you can eat the meat after the cheese without delay. But they should do cleaning, rinsing, and washing of the hands. You have to make sure, obviously, you can't have cheesy hands when eating meat or the like. And this is the idea of, you want to make sure there's nothing out there remaining. And he concludes it is better to be stringent. So there's a lot in this Ramah. Some do it, it's Kabbalistic. Some don't do it. Don't protest against those who don't. Just make sure everything's cleaned up. Good to be stringent. So you have a lot there to unpack. And so though the later authorities who note this Ramah and try to make sense of it, unpack it, they kind of look at the comments that the Ramah makes, and for the most part, 3 out of the 5 comments are about being strict. Some are stringent, Kabbalah is stringent, it is better to be stringent, right? If the other comments are about keeping things clean, and some is basically, he has 3 comments about being strict and 1 comment about not being strict. So, 3 to 1, there needs to be something strict here. Others note that the Shulchan Aruch doesn't mention this halacha here, right? He invoked, right? The Shulchan Aruch is written by Rabbi Yosef Cairo. He wrote the Beis Yosef on the tour. He talks about it in his longer conversations, but it's the Ramah who is mentioning this practice. Some are stringent. How come the Shulchan Aruch doesn't mention it? So maybe there's no reason whatsoever to be stringent. And for the most part, the consensus of later authorities is that it's complicated, and that there's enough source material to have us be concerned with this idea, and of making sure that after eating cheese, there's nothing left, there's no residue, there's nothing else like that. But they essentially go back to that Rav Chisda comment, and Rav Chisda says, you're worried about the taste after eating meat. After cheese, you don't have to wait. That's only when the cheese has no residue, no remaining taste. And here we come to the idea that there could be dairy products, there could be cheeses that do have a lingering taste. And when that's the case, you have to wait. And this is where the idea of hard cheese comes up. You may have heard the expression, you have to wait 6 hours after eating hard cheese. You have to wait the same amount of time you wait after eating meat to eat dairy. You have to wait after eating cheese, hard cheese, to eat meat. And we're going to look at a couple of the opinions that raise this issue. The Taz, Rabbi David Halevi Segal, commenting on the Ramah right there. It's in the Hebrew, we'll translate it. We'll see how some have said that this is absolutely accepted practice of waiting to after eating these types of cheeses. Some have said it's completely not necessary, and those who feel that it is standard. So first you have the Taz. And the Taz is commenting directly on the Rama, mentioning that there are those who are strict. Right, so he says, basically being strict means you have to wait the full amount of time. The full amount of time after eating the cheeses, you have to wait before you eat the meat. But what is this? What kind of cheese? Vishir Gavina Kasha, right? The hard cheese that the Rama is mentioning. Has to go be aged for 6 months. And then he says, Oh, Shehi Mitula'at. Has to be mitula'at. Who recognizes that word mitula'at from Hebrew? Tola'ot. Anyone know that word in Hebrew? Tola'ot. So literally, it means wormy. So kind of gross to have wormy cheese. But what do you think it means? Yeah, unmute.
Aged. I'm sorry, aged.
Okay, so it probably does have to be aged, but how do you moldy? So one thing that comes to mind is it says one type of cheese is 6 months old and one type of cheese is wormy. The wormy one would seem to be molded, like a blue cheese, right? Something that really, would seem to almost be spoiled, but for some reason is considered a delicacy. Another approach is that when it means wormy, it's worms make holes in things. So it's cheese that has holes in it. Cheese that has holes in it. The cheese that have holes in it are generally aged long enough that parts of the cheese contract. Think of some of the Swiss cheeses. Has holes in it. It's wormy. Now, much of the Swiss cheese we eat today is not aged, but we back then it was. So you're talking about older cheese or cheese that is wormy, which wormy certainly means it probably. I think it definitely has to be something that has a sharper taste, because of the green and the mold and the aging. And but he points out that that this idea also the same. He quotes the Isser V'Heter, one of the earlier authorities. Ein Isser b'basar achar gvina. You don't have to worry. There's no prohibition eating meat after cheese. The dafka tam basar shebepeh me'achar she'ikar nikra basar shach l'migzah ba'atu basar b'chalav. Right? He says, it's only the taste of the meat that we are concerned about consuming cheese so soon afterwards. And that's only meat. That's a meaty problem. That's not a dairy problem. It can be sharp cheese. It can be aged cheese. Doesn't matter. The Talmud is only worried about meat before dairy. But mikol makom mitzad chasidut yeshli hizaher. Yeah, you want to be a little more pious. Be more careful. So again, one of the origin sources for the Rama mentions that this is really not an issue when it comes to dairy. It's only a meat issue. If it's only a meat issue, you don't have to worry about it. But it's a nice idea to worry about it, to be out of piety. So that's how the Taz explains the background story of the Rama. V'nir l'fi dati, and I would say. Now, remember, the Rambam, what did the Rambam say the problem is for eating meat, eating dairy right after meat? The Rambam said, you're worried about the pieces caught in the teeth. Then therefore, we don't have to worry about that here because, it's the meat between the teeth. It's not even meat, but it's only the meat because it talks about basar odenu ben shnei ham. Right? Why are we worried about pieces of meat so long after eating it? So the Talmud says there's a reason to be more concerned about the meat, pieces of meat in the teeth so long after eating it. So therefore, you have to worry. But the Talmud never said to worry about pieces of cheese in the teeth 6 hours later. So the Taz says that based on there being a taste, the Talmud's only worried about, rabbis only worried about the taste of meat, not worried about the taste of dairy. And if you want to say you're worried about pieces of meat in between the teeth, pieces of cheese between the meat, is something we're not worried about. But he goes back and says, when it comes to the taste, therefore, this is the third paragraph. Shuman, pshita yesh lesor gam begvina mutlaat shetam shala nimshach bepezman rav. The stinky cheese will remain on your palate for a long period of time. Im ken yesh lahachmir. You should be careful. And then, but again, he then pivots back. It's only that type of a cheese. If it can be aged really long time, but it doesn't have those holes, it doesn't have that mold, and it wasn't made out of real rennet, right? Cheese is made out of rennet, and just as this regular cheese, regular milk that's aged and seasoned and the like, you don't have to worry about it. So, but it's still a nice idea to be careful. So the Taz kind of pivots back and forth. He mentions reasons why the Ramah can be machmir, but he also points out why the Ramah talks about being makil so much. He seems to say that it's really only about moldy cheese, and it's not really about aged cheese. So the Taz points out the real complexity and the ambiguity that we don't have a direct practice. Just like the Ramah, some are stringent, some aren't, some don't. Good to be stringent. So the Taz explains why there's so much ambiguity, because it all depends on the rationale, right? If it's based on the Rambam's rationale, they're worried about pieces of meat stuck in the teeth, so you wait for 6 hours so that you get rid of them. The Rambam didn't say anything about cheese. If you're worried about taste, well, the pungent taste is only certain types of cheese, and it's not about aged cheese. So the Taz points out kind of the complicated, convoluted backstory to the Ramah's halacha. Chochmat Adam, Rabbi Avram Danziger, writing, really is a bit of a later contemporary to the Vilna Gaon. He's writing in Vilna in the 19th century. V'minhag hapashut b'mdinot elu, the custom here in Eastern Europe. Lahamtim shisha sha'ot kadat haBeit Yosef. We wait 6 hours between meat and dairy like Beit Yosef. V'od ananog in lahachmir. And we also have the practice of being strict. Shafili machal gavina kasher, the hanashim mutlat, o sheishna shachadashim, eno chanachar afilu tav shel basar. He says, and we have hard cheese which is moldy, holy moldy cheese, or if it ages for 6 months, we don't eat anything with meat in it afterwards. So, cutting through all the different possibilities and rationales, the Chachmas Adam says the practice in Eastern Europe, we wait 6 hours between meat and dairy, and we wait 6 hours between any cheese that is aged for 6 years or has a pungent taste. We wait the same amount of period before eating meat. So that was the Chachmas Adam. The Shach points out that really no one was careful. Maharshal Sham Karatagar al Machmirim, Shukmo Minos. He says, what are you doing? He says, it's almost like heresy, right? Why are you inventing something, as we saw earlier in the Gemara Chulin? They didn't wait. So why are we adding on layers of complexity? And he says it's only the Maharam, right? The Maharam we saw quoted by the Ramah earlier on. He says that's only the Maharam, right? Remember, the Ramah started off by saying some are stringent. So the Shach says, why are we turning this into a practice? And he said the Maharam was worried because one time there was a mix-up, but if you don't have any problems, straightforward, you have some dairy, then, if you follow the instructions of the rabbis, you wash your hands, you rinse out your mouth, what are you worried about at all? And he says, the Shach says, Ein dvarav muchrachrin, the end of the second line, the Maharam's rationale is not convincing for us to make this a general rule. So that's the Shach. And the Biur Hagra, the Vilna Gaon, says, no, he says, when the Ramah invokes his various rationales for being strict, like Kabbalah, like the Zohar, he says, no, the Gemara also doesn't, he says the Gemara also points out being machmir in certain situations as well. He says this whole idea of waiting, right? We saw the whole development. Mar Ukva says he waited less than his father used to wait. The Talmud sees no problem, sees no reason not to be strict if you have a concern. So you have the established practice seems to be strict. The Vilna Gaon defends being strict. The Taz points out the complexity. The Shach thinks there's no reason to be strict. And, for the most part, there is this concern. It's kind of interesting that, how often do you encounter kind of warning labels on your hard cheeses to be careful to wait before eating meat? And it's a lot of that has to do with the industry that, for the most part, kosher cheese for a very long time, for the most part, was never entering into these categories, right? What kind of cheeses did people have? Think of the cheeses you have growing up. In my own experience, you had American cheese. American cheese isn't cheese. You had kind of smoked cheese or Munster cheese or Gouda cheeses, right? None of these are aged for a very long time, nor do they have a very sharp taste. Look, and we also saw this mentioned previously by the Taz in terms of definition of cheese. It's really only cheese if it's made with real rennet, right? Rennet is the enzyme that is taken from the stomach of the animal, of the cow, right? And that's where the Talmud is very careful about the cheese process. On some level, none of this is cheese, right? This is why you go back 100 years in America. When the American cheese came out, right, when Kraft designed it, it was a cheese product, and some felt that it was cheese and it was 100% kosher because it really was just milk and didn't even qualify as cheese. I mean, many people often invoke hearing about this idea from Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik in the 1930s and 40s, right? Over time, we have more cheeses available, and we have a more complicated opportunities, and I guess the kosher palate has developed, and the opportunities to turn this into a economically viable product have developed. And all of a sudden, anyone who's ever been to an Israeli hotel and sees the types of cheese that are there, or anyone who is taking tours of Europe, right? Or anyone who knows the cheese guy here in America, you have more complicated, complex cheeses that may enter into this domain. So it has become more of an issue, although not significantly so. How do we define hard cheese? Right, so we saw various categories mentioned. Rabbi Avram Gordimer, who works for the OU in their dairy department, has an article about this on the OU website. So what is hard cheese? So he writes, source number 11. Some poskim advance a quite conservative position categorizing hard cheese. These poskim look exclusively to the cheese's texture and only require a waiting period for cheese, which is so brittle, such as shreds or grates when cut, unable to be sliced. Hard cheese mean texturally, if that's a word, texturally hard. The vast majority of cheeses do not fit into this category. Parmesan is the only common cheese which meets this extremely limited definition of hard cheese. Right, that would say that all of the other discussion, right? We saw that being aged for 6 months wasn't necessarily accepted. We saw this idea of wormy with holes or pungent taste seemed to be the more common view. But some say hard cheese is mamash hard, it doesn't slice. Other poskim, kashrus agencies, take a totally different approach. They hold that if the cheese is 6 months old, it requires a waiting period regardless of the cheese's texture or taste. 6 months is considered hard because it's old. That also means that sometimes if you buy cheese, you can buy even a regular like American cheese, and you can keep it in your fridge for 3 or 4 months. According to this view, the more expansive view of hard cheese, that American cheese, if it's 6 months old, becomes hard cheese, and then becomes something that technically would be subject to the waiting between that cheese and meat. Now, practically speaking, I don't know how often it is they have like a dairy meal that shortly afterwards want a fleishuk meal, but it is something which can emerge. And then the third, more complex, but quite textually grounded approach is that cheese which must be aged for approximately 6 months in order to attain proper, very firm texture is hard cheese. And cheese of any age which has a potent aftertaste are considered hard cheeses for the purpose of waiting after their consumption. Right, going back to what we saw in the Taz. It's a little bit more subjective, but if it has that taste, or if it's aged for 6 months, that would have it. So you have a very limited definition, which really is only Parmesan. You have really any cheese, which is 6 months from the time it's turned into cheese, and then you have it really based on taste, as was seen in the Taz. Questions or comments? Yeah.
So I've witnessed people having Parmesan. If it's melted, it doesn't fall into this category.
So that's why that's why Fettuccine Alfredo has a halachic question. It's melted, right? You don't often the Parmesan and Fettuccine Alfredo you mix it all together, and
Right.
so that is another debate, and that actually is mentioned. That's mentioned in source number 12. There is this view that what about our Fettuccine Alfredo? Remember, it has 3 ingredients: pasta, butter, Parmesan cheese. So the answer to this question was travel back earlier than 1914, even though we established it was really 1908. We traveled to Eastern Europe in 1906. The town is Sadigora, Austro-Hungarian Empire, seat of the famed Sadigora Hasidic dynasty. The towns of Bezdin, Rabbi Yehuda, Leber Shlando publishes a remarkable work, Yad Yehuda, commentary in the Kasher section of Yoredei. Rabbi Lando writes in 8930, that's the area that we're discussing, that the stringency does not apply if the cheese is cooked into the food. The Parmesan cheese is added to the recipe as part of the sauce before it is cooked. Thus, according to the Yad Yehuda, Fettuccine Alfredo is not considered a 6-hour cheese product. Thus, the fleischiks after the Fettuccine Alfredo is safe. Vade Kashas across the country seem to go with the opinion of the Yad Yehuda and do not necessitate even a warning label that it may require a waiting period of 6 hours. That's how Rabbi Hoffman summarizes the Yad Yehuda. Others, and you can look at articles written by Rabbi Gordimer and others, other kosher agencies talk about that it's, there are differences of opinion, but essentially, if the cheese is melted in, is mixed in, cheese is melted in, it's certainly fine. What if it's mixed in and not as, what happens if you put Parmesan on a Caesar salad, for example? That could be an issue. Now, one thing to keep in mind, we're talking about Parmesan cheese, right? So officially, the official Parmesan has to be from a certain area in a certain age, a certain way, 10 months. A lot of the Parmesan cheese that is sold is not really Parmesan cheese. You have to just double check, it's like spelled with a different letter, it's like champagne. So not all Parmesan cheese is Parmesan cheese. But that's how it is. That's how it's generally addressed, and why I believe I was at a restaurant once that did have one of the menu items had a note about waiting because of the fact that it's made with aged real Parmesan cheese, and just from the way that that I have seen people consume their dairy foods, people sometimes like to put Parmesan cheese on top of pizza. Right, that might open up the situation, because if it doesn't really melt in and it's still kind of the piece on top, that could be an issue. And part of it has to do with how, with the Yad Yehuda, is it just melted in? Is it mixed in? And the like. But we see that for a very long time, this issue didn't really have as much resonance or relevance, just in terms of the cheeses that were available. But once they became more available, digging down back into the sources has opened up this opportunity to see where the complexity is. But so at least in terms of the halachos of Fettuccine Alfredo, you're good to go if you're serving that on your Shavuot menu, and then shortly thereafter want to have a meat snack. And for the most part, there is less of a concern of waiting, but as with many other areas of kashrus, now that we've become more sensitive, we're able to pick out, the areas that where there had traditionally been raised as a possibility of stringency. Now that possibility becomes, more practically relevant. Hence addressing it and bringing it to the awareness of the kosher consumer and the kosher eater. So another layer of complexity for our Shavuos holiday, our Shavuos menu. But it's all about studying Torah this holiday, so we've got to dig down a little bit more deeply into the sources and see how they will affect our appetites and our menus.